The lesson.
Oh, yeah.
At around what time did they start introducing the fencing to the yards? And
That'd be around the 90s, I reckon, early 90s or something or other. I don't 100% remember of all that sort of stuff, to be honest. Yeah, I reckon it was early 90s. I think by 91 they probably had a fence going on around Adelaide. And then, you've got the security changed over the years. When I was staying in Gawler, which I think Gawler, so they probably had a fence in 89 maybe even. No, hang on a minute. That was 1990 as well, perhaps. Yeah, so, you've got a three-rung sort of barbed wire thing going on that. And then there's tiger wire and, they sort of escalate things, and I think later on they end up having sensors and stuff like this and, and then, lights and then higher lights. And, they learn by their mistakes. And they work out, it's not difficult for them to work out which areas are being hit or whatever and that, and then, work on those from a security sort of point of view. And I always said to people in that earlier on in that, this is not going to be a difficult thing to stop. You look at Adelaide, we've probably, I think back then, off the top of my head, we had something like 5 yards, if that. That's 5 areas to lock down sort of thing from a security point of view. That's a pretty easy task. You look at other states and other countries and that, they have a lot more stabling sort of areas and that they have to, secure, and therefore it makes it more difficult. As I've said to people that go overseas and that, don't think for a moment it's any easier. There's just a hell of a lot more opportunity. And they can't be everywhere at any one time. Whereas here, well, perhaps they can. And I think, in Belair in the end and that, they had like a full bloody corrugated iron or something or other sort of fence going on that you couldn't even see through.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and look, I'm not really that 100% familiar with these sort of newer things, even if they are 10 odd years old or whatever, and that, I'm extremely out of touch of all that sort of stuff. But yeah, obviously security measures have increased over the years, and I think there were sprinklers involved in some sort of situations with sensors and that, so that they wet down the trains, and then, but it's a cat and mouse game in that, because whatever they come up with, these other guys come up with other ideas and that, and move the sensors around and all this sort of stuff, turn lights off, wear different clothing, whatever,
So is the around the time that the fencing's come in, is that around the same time that transit squads have been introduced, or was that prior to the fencing?
Well, there's always been, as far as I understand, there was always, off the top of my head, I think there was always a transit police squad. If you want to talk about a graffiti squad, that's a little bit different. I think there was always a transit squad from the sort of early, mid-'80s. And they were probably out of the transit squad that were obviously responsible for the transport system primarily. Out of those guys, there would have been, a handful of guys that took a special interest in actually graffiti writers, and then, by the late 80s at least, and certainly in the 90s and that sort of thing, I saw a second wave of these guys. They were the designated sort of, group of people. But whether you'd call them a graffiti squad or anything like that, I'm not really sure. And then down the track, transit police officers are now all, I think, South Australian police officers. So there's no distinction. Yeah. And the old days, I remember transit police officers only had jurisdiction on the on the transport network. So there were situations where some of them, I think, were full-time coppers and some of them were just transit police, so to speak. And the ones that were just transit police, when you walked off their property, there's nothing they could do. So they were sort of glorified security guards in a way. But certainly there were certain members of the transit police force who were full-fledged police officers, detective sergeants and all this sort of stuff that could go anywhere and do anything and all that sort of stuff.
Do the names Rose and Ches ring a bell?
Oh yeah, just slightly.
Do you care to tell us a bit about those?
Brian Rose was a top bloke, really. I got to say, he's a top bloke. The relationship I had with him and that, he did his job. And he didn't take his work home with him and things like that. No, he was a decent bloke. No, we had a cat and mouse game that went on in that, and we were first name basis. How's it going, David? How's it going, Brian? He's a nice bloke. He was doing his job. I was doing mine.
And so who was the other guy?
Ches. Yeah, I remember Ches. I didn't have much to do with him. Ches always sat back. I think he was like part Indian or something or other, like American Indian or something or other. That's what he looked like anyway. And Ches, I think, I wouldn't even know, but I'd suspect it was just like a nickname or something or other. And he sort of sat back being quite silent, those guys travelled together and that, and he sat back being sort of the silent partner. I never had any problems with him. Others may have or whatever and that, but yeah, no, in the interaction I had with those guys and that, he kept right out of it. I just dealt with Brian.
Mm. Now, were you, obviously you were quite active in the 80s.
Mm.
Did you maintain as active going into the 90s?
No, not in the same respect in that, yeah. No, certainly just different. I've always tried to paint and that, and no, I did a lot of paintings, I think, through the 90s and that I didn't really like and not overly proud of or whatever, but I did some good ones as well, I suppose. And
were you still in the yards in the 90s?
Oh, no, nothing like that, no.
So you'd moved away from that by that point?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I dabbled in a few overseas and that was interesting. That was late 90s.
So whereabouts overseas?
Oh, I tried a few different places in that, England, Spain, Poland. Yeah, a few Berlin. Yeah, a few different places and that, but yeah, they weren't always that successful.
The lesson. Oh, yeah.